Hi, friends.
Hi.
I'm Avalon.
I'm Sabrina.
This is Ch.8. And we are trying a new software today because the other one keeps freezing.
Yes.
So, we'll see how this works. This is, again, a second take.
Yes.
Yay.
Second take.
Second take, but with new software. So,
hopefully it works.
This will be lucky. Or hopefully we'll be lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you will.
Yep. Chapter 8. Oh, wait, recap.
On chapter 7?
Chapter 7. So that's the graveyard chapter.
They're in the cemetery. Elena accidentally opens up a tomb. She's the only person who sees that she opens up this tomb. Tyler ends up taking her away because she won't go back to dance, so they went somewhere more private in the cemetery where he started filling her up and not being very nice to her or respectful, and he rips her dress. Stefan somehow hears that she's in distress, so he ends up finding his way to her. He pulls off Tyler, kind of beats him up pretty freaking good, where his eyes roll back in his head. Elena yells at Stefan to stop. Stefan stops, and then Elena finds herself like eerily afraid of Stefan, but yet still thinks he's like really beautiful and wants to be with him. And then he takes her to the secret room that he stays in, and yeah,
that's it.
That was the event.
Yeah, it's a pretty good recap.
Yes, quick.
Good job.
Yes. Yes. Chewy approved.
Chewy approved. Elena had gone into the bathroom dazed and numbly grateful. She came out angry. She wasn't quite sure how the transformation had taken place, but sometime while she was washing the scratches from her face and arms, annoyed at the lack of the mirror and the fact that she'd left her purse in Tyler's convertible, she started feeling again. And what she felt was anger. Damn Stefan Salvatore, so cold and controlled even while saving her life. Damn him for his politeness and for his gallantry, and for the walls around him that seemed to be thicker and higher than ever. She pulled the remaining bobby pins out of her hair and used them to fasten the front of her dress together. Then she ran through her loosened hair quickly with a engraved bone comb she found in the sink. She came out of the bathroom, her chin held high and her eyes narrowed. He hadn't put his coat back on and was standing by the window in his white sweater with bowed head, tense, waiting. Without lifting his head, he gestured at the length of a dark velvet laid over the back of the chair. You might want to put that on over your dress. It was a full-length cloak, very rich and soft with a hood. Elena pulled the heavy material around her shoulders, but was not mollified by the gift. She noticed that Stefan hadn't come any closer to her or even looked at her while he was speaking. Deliberately, she invaded his territorial space, pulling the cloak more tightly around her and feeling even in that moment a sensual apprehension of the way the folds fell about her, trailing behind her on the floor. She walked up to him and made an examination of the heavy mahogany dresser by the window. On it lay a wicked-looking dagger with an ivory hilt and a beautiful agate cup mounted in silver. There were also a golden sphere of some sort of dial set into it and several loose gold coins. She picked up one of the coins, partially because it was interesting, partially because she knew it would upset him to see her handling his things. What's this? It was a moment before he answered, and then he said, a gold florin, a Florentine coin. And what's this? A German pendant watch, late 15th century, he said, distracted. He added, Elena, and she reached for an iron coffer with a hinged lid. What about this? Does it open? No, he said with the reflexes of a cat. His hand slapped over the coffer, holding the lid down. That's private, he said, and the strain obvious in his voice. She noticed that his hands made contact only with the curving iron lid and not with her flesh. She lifted her fingers, and he drew back again at once. Suddenly, her anger was too great to hold back any longer. Careful, she said savagely. Don't touch me or you might get a disease. He turned away towards the window, and yet, even as she moved herself away, walking back to the center of the room, she could sense his watching her reflection, and she knew suddenly that she must look like to him, pale hair spilling over the blackness of the cape, one white hand holding the velvet closed around her throat, a ravaged princess pacing in her tower. She tilted her head far back to look at the trapdoor in the ceiling, and heard a soft, distinct intake of breath. Then she turned. His gaze was fixed on her exposed throat. His eyes in the look in his eyes confused her, but the next moment his face hardened, closing her out. I think he said that you better go home. In that instant, she wanted to hurt him, to make him feel as bad as he'd made her feel. But she also wanted the truth. She was tired of his game, tired of scheming and plotting and trying to read Stefan Salvatore's mind. It was terrifying and yet a wonderful relief to hear her own voice saying the words that she'd been thinking so long. Why do you hate me? He stared at her. For a moment, he couldn't seem to find the words. Then he said, I don't hate you. You do, said Elena. I know it's not good manners to say it, but I don't care. I should be grateful to you for saving me tonight, but I don't care about that either. I don't care. I didn't ask you to save me. I don't know why you were even in the graveyard in the first place, and I certainly don't understand why you did it, considering the way you feel about me. He was shaking his head, but his voice was soft. I don't hate you. From the very beginning, you avoided me as if I were some kind of leper. I tried to be friendly to you, and you threw that back in my face. Is that what a gentleman does when someone tries to welcome him? He was trying to say something now, but she swept on, heedless. You've snubbed me in public time after time. You've humiliated me at school. You wouldn't be speaking to me now if it weren't a matter of life or death. Is that what it takes to get a word out of you? Does someone need to be murdered? And even now, she continued bitterly, you don't want me to get anywhere near you. What's the matter with you, Stefan Salvatore, that you have to live this way? That you build walls around other people to keep them out? That you can't trust anyone? What's wrong with you? He was silent now, his face averted. She took a deep breath and then straightened her shoulders, trying to hold her head up, though her eyes were sore and burning. And what's wrong with me? She added, more quietly. That you can't even look at me, but you can let Caroline Forbes fall all over you? I have a right to know that, at least. I won't ever bother you again. I won't even talk to you at school. But I want to know the truth before I go. Why do you hate me so much, Stefan? Slowly he turned and raised his head. His eyes were bleak, sightless, and something twisted in Elena that the pain she saw on his face. His voice was still controlled, but barely. She said she could hear the effort it cost him to keep it steady. Yes, he said. I think you do have a right to know, Elena. He looked at her, meeting her eyes directly, and she thought, that bad? What could be as bad as that? I don't hate you, he continued, pronouncing every word carefully and distinctly. I've never hated you, but you remind me of someone. Elena was taken back. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't this. I remind you of someone else you know? Of someone I knew, he said quietly, but he added slowly as if puzzling something out himself. You're not like her, really. She looked like you, but she was fragile, delicate, vulnerable, inside as well as out. And I'm not? He made a sound that would have been a laugh if there had been any humor in it. No, you're a fighter. You're yourself. Elena was silent for a moment. She could not keep hold of her anger, seeing the pain in his face. You were very close to her. Yes. What happened? There was a long pause, so long that Elena thought he wasn't going to answer. But at last he said, she died. So sad. Mm-hmm. Elena let out a tremendous breath. The last of her anger folded up and disappeared from under her. That must have hurt terribly, she said softly, thinking of the white Gilbert headstone among the rye grass. I'm so sorry. He said nothing. His face was closed again, and he seemed to be looking far away at something terrible and heartbreaking that only he could see. But there was not just grief in his expression, though the walls around his trembling control. She could see the tortured look of unbearable guilt and loneliness, a look so lost and haunted that she had moved to his side before she knew what she was doing. Stefan, she whispered. He didn't seem to hear her. She seemed to be adrift in his own world of misery. She could not stop herself from laying a hand on his arm. Stefan, I know how it can hurt. You can't know, he exploded, all quietness erupting with white rage. He looked down at his hand as if just realizing it were there, as if infuriated at her effrontery in touching him. His green eyes were dilated in the dark, and he shook her hand off, flinging a hand up to bar her from touching him again. And somehow, instead, he was holding her hand, his fingers tightly interlocked with hers, hanging on for dear life. He looked down at their locked hands in bewilderment. Then, slowly, his gaze moved from their clasping fingers to her face. Elena, he whispered. And then she saw it, the anguish shattering his gaze, as if simply he couldn't fight it any longer. The defeat as the walls finally crumbled, as you saw what was underneath, and then, helplessly, he bent down towards her lips. "Wait, stop here," said Bonnie. "I thought I saw something." Matt spattered forward, slowly edged towards the end of the road, where brambles and bushes grew thickly. Something white glimmered over there, coming towards them. "Oh, God," said Meredith, "it's Vicki Bennett." A girl stumbled onto the path of the headlights and stood there, wavering, as Matt hit the brakes. Her light brown hair was tangled in disarray, and her eyes stared glassily out at the face that was smudged and grimy with dirt. She was wearing only a thin white slip. "Get her in the car," said Matt. Meredith was already opening the car door. She jumped out and ran to the dazed girl. "Vicki, are you all right? What happened to you?" Vicki moaned, still looking straight ahead. Then she suddenly seemed to see Meredith, and she clutched at her, digging her nails into Meredith's arms. "Get out of here," she said, her eyes filled with desperate intensity, her voice strained and thick, as if she had something in her mouth. "All of you get out of here. It's coming." "What's coming?" "Vicki, where's Elena?" "Get out of here now!" Meredith looked down at the road that led and laid the shaking girl back to the car. "We'll take you away," she said, "but you have to tell us what happened. Bonnie, give me your wrap. She's freezing." "She's been hurt," said Matt grimly, "and she's in shock or something. The question is, where are the others, Vicki? Where's Elena?" Vicki sobbed, putting her hands over her face as Meredith settled Bonnie's iridescent pink wrap around her shoulders. "No, Dick," she said indistinctly. It seemed to hurt her to speak. "We were in the church. It was horrible. It came like mist around, dark mist, and eyes. Its eyes were in the dark there, burning. They burnt me." "She's delirious," said Bonnie, "or hysterical, or whatever you call it." Matt spoke slowly and clearly. "Vicki, please, just tell us one thing. Where's Elena? What happened to her?" "I don't know." Vicki lifted a tear-stained face to the sky. "Dick and I, we were alone. And then suddenly it was all around us. I couldn't run. Elena said the tomb was open. Maybe that was where it came from. It was horrible." "They were in the cemetery in the ruined church," Meredith interrupted, "and Elena was with them. And look at this." In the overhead light, she could see the deep, fresh scratches running down Vicki's neck to the lace bodice of her slip. "They look like animal marks," said Bonnie, "like the marks of a cat's claws, maybe." "No cat got the old man under the bridge," said Matt. His face was pale, and his muscles stood out in his jaw. Meredith followed the gaze down the road and shook her head. "Matt, we have to take her back first. We have to," she said. "Listen to me. I'm worried about Elena as you are, but Vicki needs a doctor, and we need to call the police. We have no choice. We have to go back." Matt stared down the road for a long moment and let out a hiss, slamming the car door. Then he put the car into gear, turned around, each moment violent. All of the way down to town, Vicki moaned about eyes. There's Matt, still worrying about
Elena.
I'm still worrying about Elena. Putting Elena first.
Yeah, but she's over here making out with Stefan.
Yeah.
Not having a care in the world for Matt.
Yeah. I feel bad for him. Yeah. Elena felt Stefan's lips meet hers, and it was as simple as that. All questions answers, all fear put to rest, all doubts removed. What she felt was not merely passion, but a bruising tenderness and a love strong that made her shake inside. It would be frightening in its intensity, except that while she was with him, she could not be afraid of anything. She had come home. This is where she belonged, and she found it at last. With Stefan, she was home. He pulled back slightly, and she could feel he was trembling. "Oh, Elena," he whispered against her lips. "We can't." "We already have," she whispered, and drew back down again. It was almost as if she could hear his thoughts, could feel his feelings. Pleasure and desire raced between them, connecting them, drawing them closer, and Elena sensed it too, a welling of deeper emotions within him. He wanted to hold her forever, to protect her from all harm. He wanted to defend her from any evil that threatened her. He wanted to join his life with hers. He felt the tender pressure of his lips on hers, and she could hardly bear the sweetness of it. Yes, she thought. Sensation rippled through her like waves on a still clear pond. She was drowning in him, both joy she sensed in Stefan and the delicious answering surge in herself. Stefan's love bathed her, shone through her, lighting every dark place in her soul like the sun. She trembled with pleasure and love and with longing. He drew back slowly as if he could not bear to part from her, and then they looked into each other's eyes with wondering joy. They did not speak. There was no need for words. He stroked her hair with a touch so light that she could scarcely feel it, as if he was afraid that she might break in his hands. She knew that it would be hatred that had made him avoid. It had not been hatred that made him to avoid her for so long. No, it hadn't been hatred at all. Elena had no idea how much longer it was until they quietly went downstairs from the boarding house. At any other time, she would have been thrilled to get into Stefan's sleek black car, but tonight she scarcely noticed it. He held her hand as they drove through the deserted streets. The first thing Elena saw as they approached her house was its lights. "It's the police," she said, finding her voice with some difficulty. It was odd to talk after being silent so long. "And that's Robert's car in the driveway, and that's Matt's," she said. She looked at Stefan, and the peace that filled her suddenly seemed fragile. "I wonder what happened. You don't suppose Tyler already told them?" "Even Tyler wouldn't be that stupid," said Stefan. He pulled up behind one of the police cars, and reluctantly Elena unclasped her hand from his. She wished with all of her heart that she and Stefan could be alone together, that they would never need to face the world. But there was no help for it. They walked up the pathway to the door, which was open. Inside the house was a blaze of lights. Entering, Elena saw what seemed like a dozen of faces turning towards her. She had a sudden vision of what she might look like standing there in the doorway in a sweeping black velvet cloak with Stefan Salvatore at her side. And then Aunt Judith gave a cry and was holding her in her arms, shaking her and hugging her all at once. "Elena, oh God, you're safe. But where have you been, and why didn't you call? Do you realize what you put everyone through?" Elena stared around the room in bewilderment. She didn't understand a thing. "We're just glad to have you back," said Robert. "I've been at the boarding house," said Stefan. With Stefan, she said slowly. "And Judith, this is Stefan Salvatore. He rents the room there. He brought me back." "Oh, thank you," said Aunt Judith to Stefan over Elena's head. Then, pulling back to look at Elena, she said, "But your dress, your hair, what happened? You don't know? Then Tyler didn't tell you? But then why are the police here?" Elena edged towards Stefan instinctively, and she felt him move closer in her protection. "They're here because Vicki Bennett was attacked in the cemetery tonight," said Matt. He and Bonnie and Meredith were standing behind Aunt Judith and Robert, relieved and a little awkward and more than a little tired. "We found her maybe 2 or 3 hours ago, and we've been looking for you ever since." "Attacked?" said Elena, stunned. "Attacked by what?" "Nobody knows," said Meredith. "Well, now it may be nothing to worry about," said Robert comfortingly. "The doctor said it was a bad scare and that she'd been drinking. The whole thing may have been in her imagination." "Those scratches weren't imaginary," said Matt, polite but with stubbornness. "What scratches? What are you talking about?" Elena demanded, looking from one face to another. "I'll tell you," said Meredith, and she explained succinctly how she and the others found Vicki. "She kept saying that she didn't know where you were and that she was alone with Dick when it happened. And when we got her back, the doctor said he couldn't find anything conclusive. She wasn't really hurt except for the scratches, and they could have been from a cat." "There were no other marks on her?" said Stefan sharply. It was the first time he'd spoken since entering the house, and Elena looked at him, surprised by his tone. "No," said Meredith, "of course not. A cat didn't tear her clothes off, but Dick might have. Oh, and her tongue was bitten." "What?" said Elena. "Badly bitten, I mean. It must have bled a lot, and it hurts her to talk now." Beside Elena, Stefan had gone still. Did she have any time to explain what happened? She was hysterical, Matt said. Really hysterical. She wasn't making any sense. She kept blabbing on about eyes and dark mist and not being able to run, which is why the doctor thinks it might have been some sort of hallucination. But as far as anyone can make out, the facts are that she and Dick Carter were in the ruined church by the cemetery at midnight, and something came in and attacked her there. Bonnie added, It didn't attack Dick, but at least it shows that he had some taste. The police found him passed out on the church floor, and he didn't remember a thing. But Elena scarcely heard the last words. Something had gone terribly wrong with Stefan. She couldn't tell how she knew it, but she knew. He had stiffened as Matt finished speaking, and now, though he hadn't moved, she felt as if a great distance was separating them, and as if she and he were on opposite sides of a rifting, cracking flow of ice. He said in terribly controlled voice she had heard before in the room. "In the church, Matt?" "Yes, in the ruined church," Matt said. "And you're sure she said it was at midnight?" "She couldn't be positive, but it was sometime around then. We found her not long after." "Why?" Stefan said nothing. Elena could feel a gulf between them widening. "Stefan?" she whispered. Then aloud she said desperately, "Stefan, what is it?" He shook his head. "Don't shut me out," she thought, but he wouldn't even look at her. "Will she live?" he asked abruptly. The doctor said there's nothing much wrong with her, Matt said. Nobody even suggested that she might die. Stefan's nod was abrupt, then he turned to Elena. I've got to go, he said. You're safe now. He caught his hand as he turned away. Of course I'm safe, she said, because of you. Yes, he said. There was no response in his eyes. They were shielded and dull. Call me tomorrow? She squeezed his hand, trying to convey what she felt under the scrutiny of all those watching eyes. She willed him to understand. He looked down at her hands with no expression at all, then slowly back up at her, and then, at last, he returned the pressure to her fingers. Yes, Elena, he whispered, his eyes clinging to hers. The next minute, he was gone. She took a deep breath and turned back to the crowded room. Aunt Judith was still hovering, her gaze fixed on what he had seen of Elena's torn dress under the cloak. Elena, she said, what happened? And her eyes went to the door through which Stefan had just left. A sort of hysterical laughter surged up in Elena's throat, and she had to choke it back. Stefan didn't do it, she said. Stefan saved me. She felt her face harden, and she looked at the police officer behind Aunt Judith. It was Tyler Smallwood. All right. So, fun times. We kind of started to see more of that psychic connection between
Elena
and Stefan. She kept saying throughout the course of the chapter, like, she could feel this rift, she could feel his emotions, she could feel all these things.
But she just didn't know how, but she just knew that she could.
Yeah. So there's some kind of connection-y thing that's going on there. Mm-hmm. What do you think Vicki ran into in the cemetery?
I think it was what was mentioned earlier when they were when Bonnie, Meredith, and Elena were first in the cemetery. They felt something like watching them or wanting to chase them or whatever. I think it's that thing.
Yeah, whatever that mysterious thing is.
Vicki.
Well, they didn't say there was a crow this time, so
no, they didn't.
But it did say that there were claw marks and, like, I don't know, crows got kind of sharp feet. I don't know.
Yeah, or it could have been something that came out of the tomb that Elena opened.
That's true. So,
maybe.
Could be something new. Maybe the crow was, like, ushering in this new evil.
Well, it was a mist, like a dark mist in eyes.
Yeah. So, I don't know.
Maybe
it's like, you know, vampires in the movies, they, like, turn into bats. Maybe this one turns into a crow.
Maybe.
He's just different. He's just different. Unique vampire. Can turn into a crow.
Yeah. Other than that, I don't really think much of a prediction. We did get to see a little bit more of Stefan's emotional side.
Yes.
Which is nice.
We got to see more of, like, how he feels about Catherine, and I think now Elena's starting to understand a little bit more why he was avoiding her, and it's not because, like, he hates her.
It's because I think it's, like, a throwback for him, and he's still trying to decide if that's really not Catherine.
Yeah.
Playing tricks on him or something.
So,
yeah.
I mean, he said that Elena was a little more bold, and that Catherine was a little more like mellow and childlike.
White snow.
I don't know.
Something like that. Yeah. Something unique.
I think that might have been in the next chapter since we had to redo both chapters.
Oh, probably.
It might have been. I don't think I remember reading that one in this chapter.
Might have been ahead.
Oops.
But yeah, he does feel that Elena is, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is.
More bold.
I guess than Catherine was.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's making him feel better.
Yeah.
About possibly letting Elena into his world. Because I think he's about to tell her the big secrets.
Yeah.
Because he's burning too.
Well, and, like, also, like, when she's exploring his room, she's finding all of these things that are from different eras. And, like, who wears a giant, like, floor-length cloak? Like, who wears a giant, like, floor-length cloak? Like, that's not from...
a modern time.
Yeah, modern time type thing.
Anywhere.
And he has a Florentine coin from, like...
And a cup.
Yeah,
Right?
agate cup from like
Yeah.
15th century or something like that. Like which teenager
Teenage boy
has that kind of stuff? So I think that some of those things are gonna like
she's starting to start questioning it.
start questioning because
Like, what's
what
the
is
story?
this? What is up with this?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, unless you just think he's very sophisticated.
For his
Pinky
age.
out.
I think she probably thinks that he's just really wise and more mature for his age.
Maybe.
Yeah, that'd be the logical.
That would be like that would be like the only explanation
Human
I would have.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
I think we're gonna find out more as the
so.
chapters come.
I think so too. Well,
Fun.
bye friends.
Bye friends.
Bye.